A very good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to the Educators panel as part of the 5th Undergraduate Research Conference organized by the Jindal School of Liberal Arts and Humanities. We are delighted to restart this conference. We had an interruption because of the pandemic, and this year we had to keep it in the online mode this year. But we hope that by next year we will all be able to reconvene in person. We have a very distinguished panel here with us today. Our topic for discussion is liberal education in times of crisis, reform or metamorphosis. The last 2 years has indeed been challenging for all of us. And this is an opportune moment for us as educators to reflect on these past 2 years and also the changing times. To think particularly about how the liberal approach to an undergraduate education really promotes an integration of learning that bridges co-curricular and the curriculum between academic and experiential learning. And also, we talk a lot about interdisciplinarity as part of liberal education. We focus on the civic aspect, where the aim of the liberal education is to create well-rounded graduates and individuals. We find ourselves in a time of change and flux and some sort of a crisis as well. The pandemic has brought forward issues on access to education. It has completely changed the way we teach and learn. Also, a key aspect of liberal arts education has been to build a sense of community within the educational institutions we teach and learn in, but also to instill a sense of shared responsibility in our students. So here we have our distinguished panel. I will introduce all of them in the order that they will speak. All of us we teach undergraduate students or have taught undergraduate students. And the idea is to bring together different perspectives from our practices and our experiences. So first, I would like to welcome Dr. Aparna Vaidik, who's Associate Professor of History at Ashoka University, not far from where we are here at OP Jindal Global University. Dr. Vaidik has previously taught at Georgetown University in Washington, DC, and also at the University of Delhi. She's a historian of South Asia who has extensively written on the history of penal settlements, island histories of the Indian Ocean, and politics of violence and Indian revolutionaries. She has been awarded research grants from the ICHR, Charles Wallace Trust, the British Academy, and the Andrew Mellon Foundation. Her most recent publication is Waiting for Swaraj, Inner Lives of Indian Revolutionaries. Her first monograph was on Imperial Andamans, Colonial Encounter and Island History. And her book, Revolutionaries on Trial, Sedition, Betrayal, and Martyrdom is forthcoming. She has also written a work of creative nonfiction titled My Son's Inheritance, A Secret History of Lynching and Blood Justice in India, published by Aleph 2020. So I would welcome Dr. Vaidik to present her views first. Over to you, Dr. Vaidik.
Thank you. Thank you, Jaini, for inviting and to be part of such a distinguished panel. getting to meet especially Professor Kirti Jain. I've heard a lot about her earlier. So yeah, I'm going to speak based on the prompts that we had received from the organizers. Yeah. So one of the first things was about my teaching experience in India. Yeah, so I'll begin with that and then just reflect on how it's been like. So as you could, as Jaini said, I had taught for several years in Delhi University, in different colleges of Delhi University before spending about 7 years in USA and then coming back and joining Ashoka. So I've had a long sort of teaching career, but the times I have been in India are like when I taught in Delhi University was very different. And now the teaching in India now is again very different. So if I were to put it all together, I would say that, your institutional location, the times that we teach in, the rank you have as a teacher, the gender you have, and all that sort of impacts the way you experience the classroom. And another factor, which is the most least talked about and the most invisible factor in the way we experience classroom is, caste or in the classroom. And these days we also have race because, as you know, in most of these liberal private universities, there's a lot of foreign faculty, primarily white. So caste and race and class, I think, is common to most educators. But you can bring, if you yourself a first generation professor, then you do bring your class also into the classroom. But and that intersects with caste. So I feel these are all the elements that impact our location as an educator in a classroom. And I have had that impinge on my identity as an educator and my experience. And in US, it was primarily the fact my ethnic identity and gender that were at play in the classroom. And that's what students engage with most when they were engaging with me as a person. So that's one thing that, not to forget our own subjectivities and our own locations as educators and how that impacts and catalyzes the classroom. So that's really my I wanted to preface my talking about what I do with that I've experienced India very differently. Like when I taught in Delhi University colleges, I've taught in evening colleges. And evening colleges where the classrooms were divided just by a sheet of cardboard. So I could actually hear the other person writing on the board, their chalk, when they were writing in the other classroom. Or several times I had to open the door and shout at all the students milling in the, in the corridors to say, please, can you quieten down? There's a class going on. So very different atmosphere from, say, what we would have in Miranda House, where I taught again for 2 years, to say what we have in Ashoka. So very different educational context within the country. Now, over the years, like when I started out, I really didn't have a teaching philosophy, so to say. But I'm a second generation college goer and professor. So I have a lot of inheritance in that way in terms of educational location and educational understanding. Yeah. So, but I did not have a philosophy of my own. So it is as I taught in different locations and as I had to change my pedagogy in different locations that I began to read more on educationists, on theorists, people who were talking and working in different areas and were having these conversations. And I know the names I'm going to take are going to be all familiar to you all, but nevertheless, I felt that really my pedagogy got nourished by through these writers and their writing. So Ivan Illich, Paulo Freire, Rudolf Steiner, John Holt, and Jyotiba Phule. Okay, so I'm going to talk about them quickly to say what I took away from them. And not just that, but how I got introduced to them. Because there's a lot of knowledge that is thrown at us, a lot of books, there's a lot of canon that we're supposed to know. Yeah, but I did not get introduced to them through academia. I got introduced to these writers as a parent. So it is really when, my kids, began to grow up and they had to go to school. That's when I actually got introduced to a lot of this stuff. And I was like, okay, intuitively, I had been trying to practice this, but suddenly I found words, I found frameworks, I found ways of doing things, which may have come to me intuitively, but I did not have a language for them. Yeah. So, and that's an important context for me because I'm an educator who's also a parent. And a lot of this reading actually led to radical changes in our home. I'll just tell you about that. So from Paulo Freire, I got that the classroom needs to raise the questions about oppression and exploitation. We need to be aware of our subject positions. Those feed into the way we teach content or we deliver content or what we think of as content and how we understand the world, ourselves in the world. So if I'm even if I'm teaching history, what I am really helping the student gather is their understanding in the world, in their understanding the larger sort of world history and where they're located and all that. Then Ivan Illich, as you know, critiques mass education, critiques schooling, and says how it leads to sort of lifelong institutionalization, and how schools derive their prestige from their ability to maintain the status quo. Okay, now for a parent, I would advise them not to read these books. Please don't read them. Yeah, because then it becomes very difficult to send your children to school. And ultimately what's happened with us is my sons have become home learners. And so an online event like this can turn into a dangerous thing of them bombing at any time. So that's where, so the impact these writings had on me not only impacted my pedagogy in the university, but impacted me as a person. And I wanted my own children to experience that freedom that can be experienced, that is outside the institutions. And then from Rudolf Steiner, so initially for some years, my older one went to a Waldorf school. So I read a lot on Rudolf Steiner's writings, and John Holt, from where I learned how children learn to learn. Yeah, and actually asking them to give the right answer amounts to playing power games with them. And how education can be a lot about exploration, investigating, figuring things out for yourself. And I was never a fan of textbooks, but textbooks are complete no-no. None of my courses ever have textbooks. Yeah, and from Rudolf Steiner's method, I learned how students can create their own textbooks. So even if you're writing histories, even in my courses, there is an attempt to get the students to write their own stuff, which will be their own and which they take away as their textbook from the class. And from Fule, I learned about the human spirit, about irreverence. His writings are so irreverent to the point, and I was like, why were they never banned? Why were they never censored? Like, you can be so irreverent and you can get away with it. Yeah. And how women's liberation was tied to that of Dalit and Bahujan community. So the feminist movement, middle-class feminist movement, or the bourgeois, the academic feminist movement, had never really addressed this question sufficiently. So in his writings, I found that combination. I was like, no, these two things go together. The woman's question and the Dalit question go together. And that's what he was trying to forefront by opening like Savitribai Phule's, attempts at education and all that. So these were all the thoughts and all the readings that, somewhere sort of, it opens you up to, you realize you need to change. You need to do this differently. And if you're not doing it differently, then there is something, you are complicit in the oppression. Yeah. So there is no walking back from this material. Once you're into it, if you've imbibed it, then that's it. You have to go forward with it. It doesn't come with a reverse gear. Okay, so now today's panel is really about the challenges and the crisis, doing all this in an age of or a period of crisis. Now, what are we understanding as crisis is? Just I quickly want to reflect on that. And I wrote down a few things for myself. Okay, when I'm thinking crisis, when I'm thinking challenges, what am I thinking about? So one is the pushback we are receiving from the government, on various fronts, educational institutions, or they're being asked to reconfigure themselves in a particular way that sometimes they find, not sometimes, most times they find pretty difficult. So that's one, the political challenge of being an educational institution today. Second is, I think, the growing anti-intellectualism in the public sphere. So it's so easy to just call me an academic, and that's become a term. And I see this not just sort of in the right-wing pushback, but also in the field of activists. An academic is somebody who is out of touch with reality. An academic is seen as somebody who's really elite. Basically, academic is somebody who doesn't give a damn. So this anti-intellectualism can surface in the most radical spheres also, where the object of where the straw man is the academic. So I feel that narrows the space of public dialogue in many ways. So when I say challenge or crisis, I'm also talking about the narrowing of that space for public dialogue, for being able to engage. And on many days I feel cancelled out just because I'm an academic. And I'm like, okay, that's serious anti-intellectualism. So because one may have things to say and share, which are perfectly legitimate. And then the third thing was privatization of education. I think we are all complicit in that in some ways. And, privatization, education was always private. Delhi University, many of the Delhi University colleges I taught at were actually trust colleges set up by these Lalajis. So education was always a result of philanthropy. Somebody was paying for it. Yeah, somebody was making it possible. But now the difference is that it is becoming more and more a tool of social eugenics. There is a greater selection going on there's a greater gatekeeping going on. So, and this became even more visible to me when we went in for school admissions for my children. That at the gate itself, the folks from Dalit or Bahujan community or the EWS quota, they'll be told online bhar do form. We are standing at the school gate and the woman doesn't know the meaning of the word online. Download karke form bhar do. She's like, what the hell is download? Like she's asking, download kya hota hai? So educational divides begins then. The child's fate is sealed at that age 3 only. So yeah, school admissions or the lack of it was always there, but there's a certain kind of urgency to it now. Yeah, with increasing privatization. And what I'm also seeing as a challenge is a shift in the way universities have begun functioning. So for say Chinese MI University, the formation of the university almost mimics the formation of the nation state. You're located in the middle of nowhere, you carve out a map for yourself, you acquire a logo, you acquire all these ceremonies. Yeah, and the migratory patterns of the students. The students are coming from all over India. So we imagine ourselves as this melting pot of diversity, which we may not be because, the student who's paying a great deal of fee is coming. So how the university seeks to mimic the nation state. Yeah, and therefore embodies a certain kind of exclusivity in the name of inclusivity. I'm a nation, I'm including you, but actually I'm excluding a whole lot of people because you're being asked to get homogenized. You're being asked for a kind of a uniformity where one may not exist. So I feel these are the challenges that I encounter as an educator. So then what is the question? What are the things that, what are the issues that we need to be raising as educators? And especially ones who come personally from very privileged backgrounds and ones who teach at very privileged and elite institutions. What are the questions for us? Because after all, we do teach at these institutions and that makes us complicit. We are complicit in the order that we keep critiquing. Yeah, so this is not about lessening my complicity in any way because it doesn't get lessened at a moral level, but what is it I do even if I'm located inside it? Yeah. So, and the few of the questions that I'm going to raise actually impacts all that sort of Jaini had said in her email about, what impacts pedagogy, what impacts syllabus design, classroom activities, student mentorship, research, how do we interact with our colleagues, how do we interact with the university administration? All that is impacted by, a lot of these questions. So what are these then? What are these questions? So the first one, when I'm making a syllabus, I keep in mind is, or I ask myself is, how do I address, lay bare, or challenge the inequalities perpetuated by institutions that are also sites of knowledge production? So not to assume that the institution is not, just because it's a site of knowledge production, is not complicit in perpetuating inequalities, because it does. So how do I address it? How do I challenge it? Yeah. How to make a university a site where power is debated, negotiated, contested, questioned, and reconstituted. Because university is not just what the administration offers to you as a university. It's not just an institution that we enter and which is pre-given. We constitute it by our presence. So if I'm constituting it with my presence, then how do I reconstitute it? How do I reconstitute the structure of power which is there. Sorry, this is, the bell is ringing in my house. This is exactly what happens. There's a formal online thing. There's somebody at the door. So I'm going to walk. Okay, someone's got the door. And then therefore, and knowing that there is a power structure there, how do I catalyze conversations on justice, equality, and democracy? Yeah. What does it mean to be an individual? What does it mean to be a collective? What does it really mean to be a community? Because communities are not pre-given, we constitute them. Yeah, pre-given ones are generally ones that carry a lot of privilege. Yeah, so these are the questions that sort of that form the impulse of the syllabi or the classroom behavior, classroom teaching, and all of that. Second, how do I critique and unteach what actually constitutes our identities? How do I address the unconscious bias? Because a lot of the students, majority of the students coming to the institutions that most of us teach at, not most of us, at least I do, are, they have already internalized a lot of oppression themselves, a lot of conservatism themselves, and are unaware of the power structures. So in that much, more education just adds to their privilege. Education becomes a thing of consumption. It's only being consumed. It doesn't change anything in their lives. It doesn't make them question anything. So how do I actually critique that for them? How do I enable them to critique their own identities, their own locations, and recognize it? Yeah, can some of them be turned to not just like doing what is expected of kids from such backgrounds, but is there a way to change the world, not just reform it? Because reforming really is about maintaining what is, yeah, not to create a status quo position. And then I think beyond the university, today's sort of educators' role, and the problem is that many of us don't see our role as extending beyond the university. I think that is also where some of us can do more, I feel. That most academics, most scholars don't see themselves, their roles as being beyond the space of the thing, of the university. But I feel that today is the time where we do need to be thinking about public pedagogy. We do need to create, support, nurture free access to education and books. We need to be understanding that we need to co-create knowledge. Because academic intellectual authority, wherever it comes from, whatever it sounds like, whatever it feels like, the problem is the point from where it comes from. That's where is lying power. So actually, when you start questioning power, you end up sort of pulling the carpet under your ground completely. Yeah, and that once you've questioned that, then okay, then how do we move out of this? How do I dismantle this? Yeah, and that's where once what we do is we do, like in our classrooms at least, they tend to be very radical. We give a lot of radical material. We critique the structures a lot, but we think that that is enough. Yeah, and that actually allows us to maintain the oppression outside. Because I have radicalized and catalyzed my classroom, actually I don't have to do anything about what's beyond. Yeah, so in some ways we are enforcing even more greater status quo on the way things are. So how do I move out of that? What are the possibilities available to me? Because as individuals, many times we also find ourselves as educators powerless to move out of that structure or to question that structure. Yeah. So, and that's something I continuously engage with. How to decolonize classroom practices. What can I do? Can I, what form, in which form our public pedagogy is possible? In what ways can we co-create knowledge? In what ways we can challenge anti-intellectualism? Yeah, so these are all the impulses, so to say, behind when I teach and when I think about myself as an educator. And do we have more time, or is this enough? This is enough, huh? Okay. Yeah, so I made myself a list of classroom practices, things to think about that, that catalyze the classroom. So I'll just give you one, I think, and I will stop with that, just as an illustrating of, the points I've been making about as an educator. So there's one thing that I have started doing is, which I call co-creating the syllabus. Yeah. So we have this course in our university called the Great Books course, which is part of a foundation courses. So I think the students do, I think it is 9, I may have the number wrong. They have to do 9 foundation courses, and one of them is Great Books. And the gradebooks course can be offered by any department. So it is not an exclusive preserve of a historian to be teaching gradebooks. Anybody can. So like once I taught the gradebooks, and I, like Toni Morrison says, she has this fantastic quote. She says, canon building is empire building. So I was like, okay, I'm not going to teach the canon in the grade books. What I will do is I'll offer a not so great books course. Yeah, so I'll offer the books that actually challenge the status quo. And so I, created a Google sheet, and I asked several students in order to put down the books they would like to read, or they would like to learn from, or any book that they felt challenged when they read it. So really the grade books course ended up being was a non-canonical, not so great books course, but yet a great books course of its own kind. And it worked well, so it's like, so can we co-create syllabi, and there is a possibility for doing that. So I'll stop here and would like to hear what other people do.
Thank you very much, Aparna, for that very interesting overview of liberal education in contemporary times. And I, as a geographer, I couldn't appreciate more the comment that you made about how, as educators, our spatial contexts also shape our practices. That's there, of course, where we are, but also the institutions that we are located in. So thank you very much for that. You've offered also some concrete suggestions on co-creating the syllabus. I particularly, and it's a point that we might come back to later, and indeed our next speaker might have something more to say. How do we sort of have our students raise questions about power in the classroom? I think the classroom is also inherently a power-laden space. And as educators, we are sometimes, or very often, I would say, complicit in enforcing it. But I think the points you make about creating a more democratic space, making the classroom a more democratic space is quite pertinent. But we'll come back to those points, hopefully in greater detail towards the latter half of the discussion. Thank you very much, Aparna. And I would like to welcome our next speaker, Professor Rukmini Sen, who teaches at B.R. Ambedkar University in the School of Liberal Studies. Rukmini works at the intersections of gender and law. And very recently, she has been awarded by the WISCOM, the Women in Security, Conflict Management and Peace, the Sahas Awards in 2020, recognizing her continuous engagement with curricula using an intersectional lens and courageous efforts to bring structural shifts in the everyday functioning of higher education spaces through innovative pedagogy and counseling. So Rukmini, I think you will have also very concrete suggestions to add to Aparna's point, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Joyni, for that warm introduction, and also thanks to the Jindal School of Liberal Arts and Humanities for organizing this really valuable, conversation amongst ourselves, liberal education in times of crisis, reform or metamorphosis. And I suppose from each of our thoughts will eventually maybe reach as to whether we are doing reformative suggestions or whether we are actually thinking about a metamorphosis in Kafka's sense. We probably have to hear all of us and also hear others to think about it. So I think I also, the prompts were extremely helpful. So I would like to state that as well as Aparna did. And I'll try and reflect on some of the issues that were raised, through the conceptualization of this conversation around syllabus designing, but also around, the classroom. You kind of posed a question also around the classroom. Aparna ended in terms of the classroom space. Look at questions around student mentorship, and also interaction with colleagues so some of those in the larger context, in the contemporary times that we are living in. Before one does this, I'll just make a brief kind of a reference to the two higher education institution spaces that I have been a part of. So one was the National University of Juridical Sciences in Calcutta. It's a national law school, and it definitely had students from all across the country. And as a sociology teacher in a law school, the kind of challenges that one faced were, of course, questions around why is it that we have to study sociology? Why not straight get to intellectual property law? So that was one bit. But the other bit that, a space that law school gave was that, you could develop your own, electives, and which was a more close-knit, intimate space, primarily because, at least the kind of electives that I had offered in the law school were around disability and law, gender and law, and law and culture. Law, culture, and pluralism was actually the title. And those were more, smaller set of students, and they exactly knew why they are taking these electives, as opposed to, let's say, more hardcore, quote unquote, hardcore law electives that would also be offered. So that was a very important space that also law school created. So, so it was like, marginality with respect to being a sociologist, but also because of being a sociologist, being able to, introduce some of these and being able to have these discussions with students. Yeah. So from there, having taught for 7 years in the law school, my shift to a space at, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar University, Delhi, a Delhi government public funded university, which is basically a social science and humanities space, with, of course, schools in management, schools in law and politics. So all of that also emerged over a period in time, but primary focus on interdisciplinarity. And I think that has been the principal basis through which AUD has been imagined. Interdisciplinarity, not just in interdisciplinary programs like, let's say, development studies or gender studies or, human ecology, but also to look at maybe sociology in a more interdisciplinary manner. And, my parent discipline is sociology. So therefore, giving us literally a space to, and I kind of connect with what Aparna said towards the end, giving us a space to actually go back and relook at canons, and to think that, the set canons that you are, of course, expected to teach when you are teaching sociology, do you teach the same? Two, do you teach different readings from the same authors? Because in a certain kind of syllabus construction, what also happens is that you end up teaching the same readings, let's say, if I take the example of sociology, of Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, whereas there are actually, they would have written other things also, which could actually be part of, the syllabus construction, which we necessarily do not understand as canons. Yeah. So to relook at canons, that was one, but then also to, in some ways open up the space around, let's say, thinking about how do you do a course on sociological theory Why is it that one would have to only do, Western sociological thinkers? Yeah. Why isn't that while doing sociological theory, you do not bring in a Phule and an Ambedkar, or maybe a Du Bois? Yeah. Again, these are not people who you would naturally study. So, so that being at the heart of, in some sense, of syllabus designing, I think one of the main principles through which at least, we in sociology have operated at AUD is that how do you make a mix of canons and contemporary scholarship? And how do you make your course design, a more inclusive reading list, which is basically driven by the principle of representation. And I think, to me, the principle of representation is at the heart of designing syllabus, the way in which the classroom is imagined and constructed, the way in which you would also imagine your assignments. I'll talk a little bit about assignments in a bit, but that, so in some ways, therefore, representativeness is something which is very important, because it is through a representative course design that you actually could bring in intersectional readings, break that canon thing, combine East, West, South, whatever we would want to call it. All of that could come in, through that. I'll move and talk a little bit about, about classroom activities, but also classroom ethics. And in some senses, I do want to believe that this last 2 years of the very specific crisis of the pandemic should make us really think about classroom ethics, primarily because it did bring in questions around access. In a way, so one is not trying to say that access didn't exist, before the pandemic, and it didn't exist when we were physically doing classroom. So I'm not wanting to believe that only a divide of online and offline education is the main, point of crisis. Students with disability would have problems with respect to access always in terms of accessing the physical space of the campus. But having said that, I would also want us to think that this gives us an opportunity to look at crisis and, questions around crisis-induced pedagogy in a big way, which is where we are. So in that context, I would, probably want to think and propose that when one thinks about classroom ethics and the practice of practices within the classroom, dialogue, empathy, and democratization, these would be at least my 3 main principles through which one arranges the classroom: dialogue, empathy, and democratization. So, it's extremely important that we think about and we talk more about listening and listening to plurality of voices as an extremely important component in a classroom. And, while one says this, one is also kind of trying to be mindful about the fact that we give a lot of importance in the classroom with respect to, classroom participation is something that we give a lot of importance to. Many of my colleagues have a certain percentage of grades assigned to classroom participation and all of that. And, there have been conversations amongst us as colleagues that what do we really mean by classroom participation? When a student asks a question, does that make it classroom participation? Yeah. What if a student doesn't ask a question? What if a student is hesitant from asking a question because the student cannot frame the question in, let's say, a proper English sentence? Yeah. So how is it that we actually enable, different kinds of listening? I think is extremely vital. And I actually would want to say that during, online teaching, one of the things that I found interesting about the way in which students participated was the use of the chat box, where you necessarily did not actually have to frame your question properly, where you necessarily were not under the pressure that if I say the English in this way, there will be others seeing me. So the chat box actually could, for some students, I do believe that it could have acted as a more liberating tool. Having said that, so listening is important, and we need to listen to silences as well. I think that's the point that I'm trying to say. With respect to empathy, I would definitely want to talk about the need for understanding different social situations that students come from. And while one understands that in a very huge classroom of, let's say, 100, 120 students, it may not be possible. Really, it may not be possible. But in smaller classrooms, in more intimate kind of classrooms, I think there is a space for that. And at least our attempt should be to understand the social, different social situations. How do we, one doesn't necessarily mean that the classroom suddenly can become a democratic space. It definitely is a hierarchical space. And in some senses, we are at, we know which side of the hierarchy we are when we are in a classroom. But having said that, to be mindful of it is very important, I would feel, because only when we are mindful of it can we actually encourage participation. So, participation as well as peer learning, as well as encouraging the students to ask questions. This move from the lecture mode to a more, dialogic mode in the classroom, I suppose is something which is really, really vital, and that needs to be, that needs to be at the fulcrum. I won't, go over and talk about, two experiments around classroom activities, which was connected with assignments and also student mentorship in some ways. So I'm going to kind of club these together to actually say, so one of the courses that I teach at the undergraduate level is around marriage, kinship, and family forms. And so this was all taught through the pandemic. And one of the assignments that I gave to the students was, and I'll read out how I had, written about the assignment. So I asked the students to describe a court marriage or an elaborate marriage ceremony or a small gathering to mark togetherness that you would have witnessed in recent times. By these three different things that I said, I kind of probably questioned that when we think about marriage, it is not just the heterosexual, big marriage, wedding ceremony that actually happens. So in a sense, to try and push the student to also think that, interfaith couples actually may not have big marriage ceremonies where their parents are supporting and all there. It may just be a special marriage act sign in the court complex. And what about people who may not be in the marital framework at all and yet share a domesticity? How is it that they would, maybe mark? Is there a date for marking togetherness in any way? So I think, while, thinking about this, I think there are two things that one attempts to do. One is that one attempts to make the student also understand and interrogate the concept around marriage. Marriage as an institution, what does it mean? Where is it? And the fact that it may not be only through a certain kind of way in which marriages happen. So that's one. And students do actually come back and ask questions and, end up also thinking about it. Yeah, I think as a teacher, if one is just being able to make the student think, yeah, that is a very, very valuable to plant the question to the student. I think that is very valuable. And then from there, one of the things to think about is that what is it that we imagine students would give us as assignments? So there's a heavy load on writing when we think about assignments. Most of our assignments try to evaluate writing or try to evaluate what we have taught through those readings, etc., whether the student have learned memory, retaining of what has been learned. So these are the two main modes in which we think about. What if we ask the student to write a blog, something that students may just generally also do, right? These days it is the blog generation, I suppose, or maybe even Insta generation that we are dealing with. How is it that we can give those spaces within within our course designing, pedagogy, in the teaching learning experiment? So that is one idea. This particular experiment that I did, it was a blog thing that I had asked the students to actually write about. The other thing is that can we go outside of the classroom within our pedagogic practices? Yeah, and which may not be a huge and many days of field visit that can be possible, for a PhD scholar. But for an undergraduate student, is there a possibility to do some kind of an exposure outside of the classroom? And one of the things that I have tried to do over the years is because I do a course around law and society or politics, law and society, I usually take students to a court complex. And it's an amazing experience. We always try to go to a district court. And because the Supreme Court is something that for many students while coming to AUD, they might actually pass through the Supreme Court. But Tees Hazari would not be something that they would, necessarily encounter. Yeah. So what it is to go to a court space, court premise, and try, again, do observations, try and talk, see what is happening. We try and also ensure that we can access one of the court rooms to see what happens. So in some ways, through this exposure to the field, what we try to actually engage with is questions around power. And try and say that, I think what I'm trying to reflect upon is that as a teacher, while there is an attempt to question power inside the classroom, question hierarchy inside the classroom, but also to make students in some way hands-on and practically aware as to what also happens outside of the classroom. In this case, law is a site. Or the observation of the marriage ritual, heterosexual, gendered patriarchy is the site of power, right? So in some ways, challenging and engaging with questions of power and hierarchy is something that is, constantly thought about. What I would like to end with is, two feminist readings have definitely helped me in the way in which one has imagined education in times of crisis. So one of them is Teaching to Transgress by Bell Hooks. This is more known. And the other is a piece that Sharmila Rege wrote for the Economic and Political Weekly, Education as Tritiya Ratna, towards Phule Ambedkarite feminist pedagogical practice. What I would leave us with is the kind of conversation that these two readings have. They bring out the importance of experience and experience of the student at, in some ways at the heart, recognizing difference, and a critical understanding around questions of both love and equality. And I think, in some ways, while love is really not a word that we necessarily attach, with questions of pedagogy, there is a way in which empathy, compassion, and love needs to be rethought as pedagogic experiments in times of crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rukmini, for those thoughts. I'm focusing on the three mantras that you left us with: dialogue, empathy, and democratization. Those are, and you also mentioned, a crisis-induced pedagogy. The crisis, of course, we are just coming out of the pandemic, or at least we would hope that's what we are, where we are now. So the pandemic looms large in our minds at the moment. The pandemic really also brought, in the initial days at least, that it's a terrible thing to happen to us, but it will also leave the world a better place. Of course, reality has been much, much further than that, and we've been left with a more fractured world. So I think the examples that you shared with us about how to make the classroom, again echoing Aparna's sentiments about making the classroom a democratic space, and listening to silences, or the importance of listening to silences, was great advice. So thank you very much for that. Our next speaker is Professor Kirti Jain. Professor Jain is the former director and professor at the National School of Drama. She's a theatre scholar. She's directed plays, contributed articles to theatre journals and books, and lectured at national and international conferences and universities. She taught at NSD, the National School of Drama, for several years, and she's worked with a range of Indian theatre directors with a focus on women directors, has published articles in theatre anthologies, and is currently associated with the publication of a Hindi theatre journal. She's also the recipient of several awards and felicitations. Professor Jain was honored with the B.V. Karant Smriti Purashkar for her contribution to theatre in 2010, and the Sangit Natak Academy Award for Direction in 2011. I think we've spoken a lot about the importance of arts in creating a sense of community. Professor Jain, we welcome you here on this panel, and we look forward to hearing from you about using theatre as part of the curriculum.
Thank you, Jayani. I've been listening to these two most engaging presentations, and sort of what I had sort of prepared for what I'd be speaking seems to be changing in my mind, that I need to take some of those points forward. And as you would all understand, that I come from the discipline of theatre, and in these times theatre was ironically most under threat, when theatre was exactly what we needed the most. Theatre is what allows for dialogue, for sharing, for participation, and creates a kind of democratic space, which, as you all know, that even when theatre was called the Pancham Ved at that time of Bharat, what he had in mind that this would be one space which is not just for the Brahmins and the upper class, but for all concerned. So that has been space. I would begin because a lot of you may not even have conceptualized or thought about how theatre can be taught. I encounter questions, very basic questions like, can theatre be taught? Is training necessary? Aren't people just born with the talent? And I always feel surprised that they don't ask these questions about music or about dance or about anything else. But yes, theatre, everybody feels that it's an inborn thing and it can be done. So I go about explaining that, all right, at the National School of Drama, we have a very rigorous course, which is 3 years, morning 7 o'clock to night 12, 1, 3. And there is still so much more to do. And people say, oh, so what do you teach? I mean, what is there to teach in so much time? I mean, how do you take so much time? Can creativity and imagination be taught? And all these questions. So, sort of one has gone through these questions. and also battle with this, or this has made me encounter this whole idea that people are not really aware of what theatre is all about, what all it can do, and what is the potential. And that means that, we need to educate people more and more about theatre. And that is where I thought that, let me talk. One of the questions that kept arising when I was at the National School of Drama was that how is this professional theatre course, which is meant to create theatre professionals, how is it different, or should it be different from what is taught at the university departments? There are, I don't know, I'm not very sure of the numbers now, but till some years back, there were about 45 theatre departments in the country in various universities. And strangely enough, we didn't hear of, sort of many students who were really emerging from that. We encountered some of those students when they applied for a drama school training, even after having done their MA in dramatics in these university departments. And that is when this whole question of distinction come in, sort of even in our discussions or in your mind, that why is it that having done 5 years in theatre studies, they're needing to come to drama school? Is it something different? Is it to do with quality? Is it to do with the kind of pedagogy which is different in the university and the institution here? And how do we address this problem that people don't have to duplicate, or people don't have to spend so much time in making that decision? So I would say very broadly and briefly that I would say very simply that a professional training course like the drama school is for creating theatre professionals, practitioners. And therefore, very clearly, the focus has to be on the practice, on learning of that practice, the skills, the methods of different approaches to how do you approach a role and perform, or how do you perceive the, sort of a theatrical reality differently, for different methodologies that you actually practice and learn the skills that are required. So, in drama school, we had about 20 subjects that we were teaching. So just an acting student would start with yoga and movement, and then voice, and then speech and music, and then improvisation, dance, movement, and then preparing a role and things like that. So these are just some of the acting disciplines. And then there would be similar in the technical, and then in the direction, which is a combination of all of these. And to get a general idea of what the theatre history is, where they are located, they would have to talk a little bit about theory and history of theatre. So this was huge, and it was partly huge because initially drama school was trying to do the role of both what the university should do and what a practice-oriented institute should do. That also needs to be revised. But what I found particularly problematic in theatre departments was that there was no clearly defined objective for why that course was being run. So they resulted in making a kind of tentative copy of the NSD syllabus, mimicking that kind of syllabus and curriculum. And because universities have a different set of guidelines, they don't have the kind of freedom NSD enjoys in calling the kind of expert we want. We would have a guru who probably has not even studied till class 8, but is a master of his craft and art. So we would be able to bring him in as our faculty, where the university would not be able to do that. We could be rehearsing and working on a text for 8 hours a day, which again, I think the university would not be able to provide. We might require budgets of huge proportions and spaces where different kinds of work would happen, which once again the university would not allow. So I think it was those constraints which were, sort of also creating the confusion that while they had a NSD kind of syllabus, but they were not able to get the right faculty to be able to impart that syllabus. And they were not able. So what would happen is that, let's say, a literature professor interested in theatre would start teaching. And the problem is that, there have been ways of looking at a dramatic text, which could be very literary and they could be performance oriented. And what was required was a performance oriented perspective, which was not happening. So, there was a very confused kind of quality in the students who were coming from there. And you felt bad that they have spent 5 years and the department is trying its best to do what it can do. But because of, as I said, guidelines and because of lack of clarity, that's really not being achieved. So I would like to, because it's a kind of university forum, I just thought that I will share what I feel the university departments could really focus on, which would make them different from drama school kind of institutes, and which would make them a very, very required input. In fact, I wanted to end with an appeal that please more and more drama departments open in universities, which keep in mind this difference and focus on what they can do best. So I would say that, they would, if they are there, it cannot be without practice, because unless you understand how space transforms a certain set of words or a certain set of actions, the understanding of the text can never be real. So practice and theory sharing would definitely have to be there, but probably the focus could be more on the theory part, where then, the teaching could be on theories, on essential concepts, on history, on criticism, on research, pedagogy, experimentation, appreciation of the form, emerging genres, performance studies. These are things which would, which are not being studied anywhere in our country. And that is why we don't have any very serious research that is coming out on these areas, which probably is a lag we feel as practitioners very often, that there's nothing which gives us a sense of what we can do, what is happening in other forms, for instance, within the country, what could be the direction. There is no guidance that we get from, large. And since interdisciplinary work is possible in universities, they can have a synergy in teaching, literature, psychology, history, education, management, women and child studies, communication. All these can use theater, and theater can use all of these to enrich, the understanding of what theater is all about. And I would say that the purpose would be, one of the questions that arises is why should theater be taught when there is really no avenue for people who are learning theater? That's a very real question, even for professionals who take training at the National School of Drama. But I would say this would be a more real question for university departments. But I think we have a very strong need of dramaturgs who help with the research, who guide directors, who kind of create a structural, conceptual framework, which is an essential in most of the serious theater that happens all over the world. We need theater teachers, so a focus on pedagogy would really create more knowledgeable theater teachers with an understanding what pedagogy can be about, critics who understand both practice and theory and history and where it can be situated, therefore scholars, community workers, facilitators for personality building. And I would say that it can create very good teachers for schools where theater can be used as a tool, or rather not theater as a tool, but theater methodologies can be used as a tool for, teaching various subjects. Now, I would want to come to one of my favorite topics, or rather my passion. But when I was heading the institution, at that point itself, I had introduced the Theatre in Education company at the National School of Drama with the idea of creating a more active interface between theatre and education. We couldn't really go very much forward within that. We were a performing institution, So it focused on performance. But, and therefore we used the theatre in education methodology for that and reaching out to schools and children. But what is much more valuable, in my view, is what we call the process drama, or sort of drama in education, where actually sort of all these questions that were being discussed about dialogue, empathy, democratization, and co-creating, real participation, all of this really comes together. And here I'll just give an example. Of course, it's misunderstood whenever we talk to schools or we talk to teacher training institutes. They say, yes, we use drama, we do a lot of enactment of chapters, but that's not what it is about. This is about not performing or not even enacting. It does include role play at times, most of the time, but it is about actually giving the full agency to the student to find answers to a question. So after retirement, I've been working on this methodology of how to teach various subjects using tools that we use in drama and theatre. And that has been a very, very enriching experience even for me. While trying to do this, I felt that I wish I knew all of this earlier. I could have engaged it in my teaching while I was at the drama school, which I couldn't at that time. But now when I see it, and I'll just give you one or two examples that we were working with a group of children, which were in, I think, third class students. And the session was supposed to be on gender sensitization. So one of the first things we began with, just make them into small groups. There were about 50 children, and asked them in groups that, all of you go back, take 5 minutes and decide a uniform for the school, which is gender neutral. Sort of everybody has to wear the same uniform. So all of them went, all of them came back happily with the options. And all the options were about, sort of pant and shirt, or coat and pants, or half pants and whatever. None of them talked about skirt and blouse. None of them talked about frocks. None of them talked about salwar kameez. So when they were asked that how come you didn't, why could it not be this? So they all laughed. The girls sniggered, the boys sniggered, because they could not even perceive that that's a possibility. So that was our entry point into making them aware of, sort of how these gender biases are so ingrained that we just think that that's not possible. The other thing is not possible. And that makes for a very interesting, direction in which you start doing different exercises subsequently. I'll give another example in how, sort of students were asked. There was another gender thing which was more to do with the performative. We had prepared a play on Razia Sultan. Maya Rao, you might have heard, she directed this play with the TI company, and we took it to schools. Now, in a boys' school, there is a point in the play where, sort of the other courtiers are telling Razia that, you can't handle you can't be the emperor because, you're a woman and you won't be able to handle it. And her brother is being pushed. And there's a lobby which is pushing her to become the emperor because the brother is no good. So she, in the play, there are spaces where you can begin a dialogue with the audience. So she at one point comes to the children and says that, I'm very nervous. Do you think I'll be able to handle if I become the emperor? So the boys said, no, you won't. So she said, why? And they said, no, because, you won't be able to fight when there is a battle, sort of women can't fight. She says, yeah, but, sort of Indira Gandhi was the prime minister, she didn't go to fight. So I can maybe tell others to fight. But they were very strongly of the opinion that she can't handle it. So different questions came up about costume, about background, about being a woman, being a mother, all these. She was provoking them, of course, but then these came. The same performance in a girls' school, when she asked the question, they said, yes, you can. And, sort of then they were giving arguments of how and why. They can give it all coming from their perspective. What they understand a woman can do, can't do, should do, not do. So we were actually bringing Razia as a historical thing, where of course the whole ambience was created. So they then start visualizing history in visual terms, in musical terms, what kind of music, what kind of sounds, what kind of food. But other than that, becoming contemporary in terms of the question of gender and how these biases play out. So what I'm saying is that every time we work with children, the whole agency is with the children. The whole burden of thinking about an issue is put on the children, and they have to come out with answers. And then because they're children from different backgrounds, they come out with different answers, different solutions. And there is a whole lot of peer learning that happens because the facilitator is trained not to give any judgment, that this is right or this is wrong, but that, sort of all of it could be different perspectives, they could be coming from different backgrounds, and they all need to be valid and to be thought about, that what, sort of how you can go further. So I personally feel that this, we call this curriculum drama, where we work on different subjects. It could be history, it could be civics, it could be geography, it could be, of course, languages lend themselves very well for this. But that we can teach these subjects through this kind of methodology, where there are different kinds of role play. If there is time, I'll give you one more very interesting example, is that there was a small lesson on Helen Keller, and that had to be introduced because it's a small essay, and we were doing a teacher training workshop, and they said, this is very tough, we don't know how to make it interesting, so if you could do it for us. And so it was facilitated with a group of about 50 students. But I'll just give you one example. I love that exercise. That at some point, after having, sort of got them emotionally involved with this person who can't hear and who can't see, and to understand the implications of what it would be, because when the facilitator asked them that, what do you think she can do, when she grows up, because her mother is very worried about her. They would initially begin with, she could be an art teacher, she could be a music teacher, and then they would be reminded that, she can't see, so what kind of an art teacher, and when she can't hear, how can she do music? So gradually they started understanding the implications, limitations. And then at one point he told them that, in her private room, I found a suitcase which is locked. That's a personal belongings. So what do you think would be in that suitcase? And then they came out with all kinds of things that Helen Keller might have collected as a child. And then he said, oh, I found a little diary, cassette recorder, but which is, cassette which is broken. But it just seems to be something that she has said to her mother. What do you think it could be? And then the kind of things that came was so moving, because, sort of it was all of them putting themselves in her place, that they were saying कि आप चिंता मत करिएगा, अपनी मदर से वो कह रही है कि चिंता मत करिएगा, मैं आपको बहुत बड़ी वो बन के दिखाऊंगी. Or somebody saying काश मैं भी देख सकती, or somebody saying that so and so has been very helpful to me, so don't worry, people will help me. So all this was a very involving, emotionally involving thing, after which I think we did not really need to tell very much about Helen Keller, but the whole message of what it means. So it was an exercise in inclusivity, in participation, in giving agency to students and getting them to question, and which is what education needs to be about, in students being empowered to question, to share, to demolish whatever be the hierarchy. And in this, one of the things that naturally happens is demolishing all hierarchies in teaching. So I would really, really appeal once again, make a plea that not only should more theatre departments should be created, but structured, keeping in mind the need. We need an audience, we need theatre appreciation by a larger number of people, younger people to be involved, and of course to think about this methodology for subject teaching that department can initiate. and interact with different departments to, sort of include it in the teacher training programs that it can offer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jain, for sharing those wonderful examples. I think your idea of using theater as pedagogy or in pedagogy made me connect the point that Rukmini was making earlier about dialogue, empathy, and democratization, and how theater can be a tool to bring that into the classroom. And I was also reminded of the point that Aparna made earlier on about how the classroom needs to raise questions around oppression, and but how we also need to think of learning beyond the classroom. I think Rukmini made that point. And it reminded me of, Auguste Boal's Theatre of the Oppressed movement, and of how we can also envision theater playing a role outside the classroom in education more broadly. So thank you very much for your insights. We might be able to come back to some of those points later on, I hope. Our next speaker is Dr. Manju Edachira, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences in IIT Delhi. She taught at the Center for English Language Studies at the University of Hyderabad before this. Her research is on contemporary Malayalam cinema, caste problematic, and anti-caste aesthetics. She was a Kerala Chalachitra Academic Fellow in 2021 and an Erasmus Visiting PhD Fellow in the Film Studies Division at Freie University Berlin. So her research interests include film and cultural studies, literary studies, and comparative literature. And she's currently working on caste and contemporary Indian cinema with a particular focus on affect and aesthetics. And we hope that Dr. Edachira will bring another aspect of the arts into the discussion and see how we can perhaps address issues around access as well. Over to you, Dr. Edachira. And thank you very much, Professor Jain.
Thank you, Dr. Banerjee. Am I audible? Okay. Yeah, thank you for that introduction. And yeah, first of all, I should actually thank the organizers and of this particular conference, and also inviting me to this conference. And I'm actually very happy to share my thoughts along with this other distinguished speakers. So yeah, I would actually start off with perhaps the title, which is Liberal Education in the Times of Crisis, Reform or Metamorphosis. So one thing which I would want to talk about is also as Dr. Banerjee was talking about my own research interest. It's largely film and culture studies, literature and language studies. So I would be largely talking from that perspectives, and yeah, among maybe I would be the one with the least teaching experience. So that itself also during this pandemic time period, so which is again makes it more complicated. So there is some shift which happened with me, which was immediately after my submission of PhD in 2019, I started teaching. So that just 2 semesters, I taught in person, and then everything became online. So there was also a shift from the other side of the table to this side of the table, and that kind of brought a lot of responsibility. And until then, you are only responsible for yourself as a student. But then that's in this whole, there was a shift which suddenly happened after the submission and once I started teaching. So that is something which I was just slowly I was getting into it, and then this whole pandemic thing happened. So So I was just, I've taught at Hyderabad Central University, undergrads largely BA, BSc, and BTech students. And right now I'm in IIT Delhi. Here also I'm offering a course called Language and Culture. This is again for BTech students. So I would be also talking largely from my experience of teaching language and also film studies and film and culture studies, what to say. So yeah, so to talk about that, one of the things, yeah, which I wanted to also like talk a little bit on this, the idea of like human sciences or humanities, which I am part of. And it's, of course, like these days, everything is largely interdisciplinary. And also like this, there is something to more to talk about this human sciences or humanities is largely or the disciplines under which give largely importance to this ideas in that sense, like what are the ideas, which is what we always engage with, and what happens to these ideas in the time of this pandemic. So that is something which I thought I would talk a little bit here. One is to think of like, especially liberal education in a sense, like more liberative in that sense, and what ideas to do that, what, like, how do we engage with it? So one of the things, like what happens to ideas in the age of digital technology is also like, as you actually mentioned, access. So access is also one thing which there are like two ways of looking at it. One way we can say that things are accessible due to this technology. You have access to all the information, perhaps at least those who can afford, but then it's not like it is, these classes are recorded or available, or most of the time, like you can just, by the click of your fingers, you get a lot of information. So that is one side. Another side, as I think Professor Vaidik actually spoke about how the oppressed can access or education itself. So that is another side. We are also talking about that question. So that within this two problems, or the two issues, another thing which is also like, another like one thing which I would also think of, like all this information is like there is no time and space restrictions. You can access it anytime and any moment. So one I thought I would also share from my experiences that so this classes are recorded. So most of the time, like you do not see your students. I mean, like most of you might know, like because like I always switch on my camera. So so one thing I figured out from my own experience is that so there is always this people are conscious that what you are telling or what you are discussing is being recorded, and kind of censors ideas in one way. Perhaps like one side, of course, these are available, these are always accessible, but the censoring of ideas happen because I am telling this because there are certain times teachers would also be careful. At the same time, students would be careful, as Dr. Sen was talking about, like listen to silences. And in fact, online classes are largely silent, and I mean, how do we actually deal with it? And I had experience of once I by the time I finish my class, I sometimes ask, do you want to tell something off the record? So by the time I switch off my recording, so I figured out that a lot of students actually talk that time. I mean, not like many, but then again, at least like 4 to 5 students actually ask certain things, and they want to, whatever they want to ask, they wait till that moment. They will not, until then I don't know, they might not be comfortable with that. So that is something which I thought there is always this one side, we look at the possibilities, but other side, there is always this thing of ideas. That is one thing which I thought I would talk about. Second thing is another, which is also one crisis or one problem which we would be talking about, this stealing of ideas or plagiarism, which is quite, I mean, it's like, because information is accessible and everything is accessible, and technology is also advanced, that you also can use the same technology to figure out like whether it is plagiarized or not. But otherwise also, like, we know that there is something like that, whether we can see as this, there is stealing of ideas, or you actually perhaps students might not, or sometimes it is because it is taken for granted that these are accessible. So in that like this two issues which I was thinking, there is one side censoring of ideas, and on the other side which is this plagiarism, or the stealing of ideas. So how do we actually look at this issue? So which like some of the ways which we can actually think of is to come back. I'll come back to that point, like when I talk about some of the ways to actually look at this issue. So these are two things which I thought I would start off. And another thing to add on, which I would connect towards the end, which my own experience of teaching language. So language teaching is largely like it's, I mean, when I started teaching language, like English language. And I've offered a course called Language Through Literature. But my course also had other cultural texts, such as songs and even plays and films and things like that. So, but there was this lack of communication, which was at one, like something which I found it very difficult. So this is at the level of language teaching, but at the level of film studies teaching, there is something else which I want to share, which is so the ideas of like as per film studies discipline, the terms film and cinema are actually conceptualized differently. Like film is an individual unit of any motion picture which you watch it on in a phone, in a TV, or your laptop screen, or a theater. Anything can be an individual. Even a short ad is a film. Whereas cinema is conceptualized in a larger level, where cinema is the place where you go and watch, which is largely the theater. So it is that sense, and also cinema as an industry. So which is like we talk about Hindi cinema, or Malayalam cinema, or Tamil cinema, or Telugu cinema, like that. So there is two kind of conceptualizations. But when we come to India, so there is no different, like this two different kinds of conceptualization. For us, everything is a film or cinema, or like largely everything is cinema, not necessarily even film, but we largely tell that I watched a cinema, not perhaps nothing else. Like just think of in your own regional languages. So in Malayalam, it is called padam, and same thing in Tamil as well. Or in like I've heard a lot of other language friends talking about picture. It's not one picture, it's picture. It's a like Indian variety of because we actually adapt that, we actually take it as our own language. The same thing, which also like we actually cinemas, we do not use the Doordarshan or the term like Chalachitra or Chalachitram, which is more of an official term. What we use is largely cinema. So for us, cinemas, the experience of watching also in a theater. So that is it's meant to be a community experience. So I'm telling this because I actually screen films. And like largely, like I've largely screened English films, which are like 1.5 hours to 2 hours. So we watch it together, I mean, along with students, and we have discussions on that. So you can actually experience that students have a lot of like, when perhaps like you would want to talk about certain aspects. But I figured out that after watching, students come up with very interesting ideas from perhaps different scenes, or something which you haven't thought of, or something which you can actually add on. But when it comes to the online mode, what you can only do is you can only show some clips, which like perhaps just 2 minutes or 5 minutes clips. So there is this lack of the shared watching experience, which is something very important to teach, or like the same way which we were also talking about the community of teaching and teachers and students. So the same way, this lack of shared watching experience, which is also very important for South Asian cinema. It's not even like in comparison to perhaps other film studies. There is this shared experience, which I found it quite like it was very difficult. Like, so then I also had to do certain like changes in my own syllabus to add, like to bring in these differences. So so one of the things which I thought is to how do you actually to talk about these two things, like as in there is this lack of shared experience, and there is one side we also talk about lack of communication, and the earlier what I was talking about, the problem with the ideas, like the censoring, and also the plagiarism, and how do we actually deal with this question. So one thing is we have to go or to look at this liberal education as something which is generative and transformative, like something which can actually transform so not only students but also teachers. So in that sense, so one of the things which actually actually some of the points were also spoken by the earlier speakers, but to talk about an emancipatory curriculum or curricula in that sense, because how would we actually add? One thing which I found is like perhaps we can do two things. One would be to incorporate non-canonical works with canonical works, which like non-canonical works, which actually both like the speakers spoke, or add things which are not necessarily canonical, but the writers who are kind of like established writers, you do that. Or there is another thing which perhaps, like I'm from also literature, what we do is read canonical text itself from a different perspective. So that's something which we quite a lot do. Like you bring in your own, what we were talking about, experience or your own perspectives to read perhaps when some of the canonical texts. What we do in like what we should or what we can do to students at this undergraduate level is to introduce the multiple perspectives. So it is perhaps like research level, it is something different where you can actually focus on only one idea, or like perhaps it is because it's more specialized. But undergraduate level, what you can do is you can introduce multiple perspectives. So like the language course which I had different elements, which like some of the things which other speakers actually told about representation, but also about also reading the major text from different perspectives. So that's something which I thought we can actually think of this in a sense that, so that there is something which again I wanted to talk about was this, then the centrality of ideas beyond this immediacies. Like you can actually, like, of course, like we have to create this material conditions for creating ideas. Of course, that is necessary. For instance, like privatization of education is there, which we all know. So perhaps institute fellowships or provide opportunities for like to get internships, but then students should be able to also follow certain ideas or to work with it, like without the fear of like that their ideas will be censored or in a sense that you have to create a meaningful creative critical pedagogy or what we largely like move towards in humanities is something called critical and comparative humanities. So as we know, these are the interdisciplinary field, but more than interdisciplinarity, it is like you look at things not in isolation, but like from different perspectives or in relation. So that's something which we do, and I'm also a comparative. So it's like you look at things in relation. So that is also something which we can look at, or we can actually take up. And so yeah, another thing which of course I also like some of the theories which we actually spoke about, like of course, like Bell Hook's teaching to transgress is something which I also found it very also when I just started teaching, I found it very inspiring to actually teach. I mean, you are transgressing, you are creating a new pedagogy to engage with students through the critical pedagogy, which like in Paulo Freire's terms, which is not like kind of you're providing information, but you are creating it together. So that is something which I have also have taken inspiration from there. And to end with, so some of the things which I've been talking about to connect with that is so that the pedagogy which we were talking, it has to be also effective in nature, in a sense that it needs to reach out in a much more effective sense, because it's not necessarily like, teachers are not just information providers, because if you can get everything from Google, but then what is important is we should be able to inspire ideas, and and also from different locations, students from different locations should be able to also associate with that. So in that sense, it has to be that pedagogy has to be effective in nature. And so that is something which, and also to connect with some of the points which all of you spoke about, the subjectivity question, or the democratization, which Dr. Rukmini spoke of, and also the performance aspect, like actually teaching itself is, in a sense, it's performative. Like you cannot sit and like listen to somebody who's just speaking in like the same tone. Like you also have to like have certain that element in that as well. So to connect all this, what I would suggest is that it has to be in a more that it has to create a creative and critical pedagogy, and it has to be effective. So yeah, I would stop with that, and thank you everyone, and also for Jindal School of Liberal Arts. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ridashira. I think the fact that you also started teaching during the pandemic, mind that we hadn't till now, we hadn't met many of our colleagues. So we've been talking about democratization of space, collegial, bringing in a collegial feeling in liberal education. And listening to you talking about how students react to the online format, and particularly of classes, it made me think how come into the classroom. So I very visibly in the visual format. Here we are looking at each other, being in different spaces, and we can sort of see the other world. But actually, the other worlds are always in the classroom. And I think everyone here today highlighted the fact that those of us who this idea of liberal education needs to think about these other worlds. At times, of course, some of these worlds may be more uniform than in other places. As Undergraduate pointed out earlier, it's just that idea of being aware of differences in beyond our time, but I will just try to summarize very quickly and perhaps maybe raise questions, talk about some questions that came to my mind. And if the audience has any questions, please type it in the chat box. We might take this.
Your sound is splitting.
Oh, really? Can you hear me now? Is this better?
We can hear you, but it's strange. It's splitting. So I don't know why that is happening.
Is this the case for everyone?
Yeah. Yeah, I thought it was a problem with my speaker, so I was trying to adjust that. I think there is
a distortion.
I will try to move space and see if this works. But yes, just to highlight, listening to all of you brought this ideas of classroom as a shared space. The theme of this panel was to also reflect on the idea of liberal education in times of crisis. I hope I'm audible now. Looking at you, it seems it's still breaking up. Am I? Okay. Then what I will ask Dean who's here to perhaps share some of her viewpoints and thank. I'll see if there are any questions, and hopefully when I come back, I'll be more audible. Dean Rodrowski, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there. Can you hear me, or am I breaking up too? Okay. Okay, maybe you can get your mic fixed. We're trying to get tech to do it. Okay, thank you all very much. I listened to the entire program. It was really wonderful listening to all of you, and it's like visiting old friends. Old friends because all of the names that you're saying, things like Paulo Freire and other educators. I've used Augusto Boal all the time in my classrooms. And so, all of these ideas, bell hooks, of course, is a perennial favorite. But it brought to mind also something else that I've felt that, here we are. I'm from the US and I studied in France, and we're all in India, and many of you have had a European US education. But I would hope at some point that we have educators that were reading from other parts of the world. And for me, that would be, really wonderful to have a broader spectrum. I believe fervently. I've been very influenced by the pedagogical approaches that you people have cited. I think they're wonderful, but I'm just wondering, how can we broaden the vista with this? And I was also thinking of something that I found that Dr. Kriti has brought up, Jane has brought up, that's really interesting, and that's bringing in theater, expressive arts into the classroom. I think they should not be taught as separate modules, but I think a lot of the things that are used in these areas, as I think that she suggested, can really be powerful pedagogical instruments for all of us. It's, something that would be wonderful. The other aspect that some of you brought up, and I think really has to be worked on, is intercultural communication. By this, I mean not multiculturalism per se, but real intercultural communication with people in our communities. We have such a way of limiting different voices, different perspectives. It wouldn't be an easy road, gender differences as well. How do we allow this? How do we allow people from the community? I tried when I was teaching in the US an experiment which really worked well. Every year I would teach a course with someone from the community. And these would not be people who would be, it was a fight to get them accepted with the proper salary and everything in the classroom. But I felt that our students had so much more to learn from the Native American, from the preacher in the local evangelical church, that we would co-teach a course and also give credit to the people and honor their knowledge. So I felt my students were the winners. The co-instructors were the ones who sacrificed, but it was a wonderful experience for me and for my students as well. And then let's hope Johnny got her voice back again. But one other thing I want to say that was created for me with when we were teaching online. And that's bringing in the idea of multiple intelligences. Given the amount of space, students didn't really appreciate how much space they were allowed. But bringing in ways of expressing their ideas using different vehicles, other than simply writing and repeating what was in the text, is something that I just hope we can keep up with. And by that, I mean, Howard Gardner wrote a lot about multiple intelligences, but students painting on screen, students using music, sound, space, the visual language is so potent as an educational tool. So all of these things, I think we've all learned so much from. I think we do not know yet how much we've learned. And I think that, it merits further exploration. Your talks were so wonderful. They really opened up a lot of different aspects about pedagogy, things we have in common and things we don't have in common. I would really love to have one ambitious wish, and that's that we could even do a modest publication collecting your ideas and putting them together. And this would be a way to continue our dialogue. So thank you so much for your participation. I hope we can all see you in person on campus. Some of you are on campus, but I hope we can have all of you come back to campus and to visit us, and we can continue the dialogue. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I hope my microphone has come back, but since miraculously, great. But since we've really run out of time here, I don't see any questions in the chat box yet. And if there are any, I'll be happy to send it over to the panelists. But I just wanted to echo Kathleen's thought on the generosity with which you've shared your practices and experiences. I think this made the panel a very rich discussion. One idea that I was thinking of throughout the discussion was this idea of community, something that we also talk about a lot in also critically within the context of liberal education, and the extent to which the digital has impeded that or facilitated that. Anyways, I'll leave it there and thank everyone for their conversation. As Dean Modrasky suggested, it might be good to put them together as a piece to help us reflect further and continue this conversation. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to all the panelists and to the audience for joining in. I hope you have enjoyed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Are we still live?
Yes, you're still live. And you have the good mic. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much, Jenny. I think we can now move the session. Vidyajit, could you end the live session, please? Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.